Okay, hello Peter Gray. I have simple question to you. What is influence of school coercion on the brain? How harmful is school coercion?
I don't know of any neuroscience research on the effect of schooling on the brain itself, on the physical brain. By the way, there is research, to go back to what I was talking about before, on the effects of video games on brain development, showing that those parts of the brain that are involved in much of higher order thinking are actually grow as a result of playing video games. So interestingly, we know there are positive effects of video games on the brain. We also know that whenever you learn something to a great degree, especially a kind of skill, the brain changes, the brain grows as a result of that. Uh, there were a study many years ago of taxi drivers in London back before they had GPSs. And to be a taxi driver in London, you had to memorize the entire map of London and know how to get from one place, any one place to another place by the way of the shortest route. That took a tremendous amount of work to learn all that. And there were studies showing that those parts of the brain of the so-called hippocampus that are involved in spatial learning grew in taxi drivers. So I don't know of any such studies looking at how the brain grows or deteriorates as a result of courses in school or particular kind of schooling. We do know something about cognitive changes that have resulted in school children in the United States as a result of the intensification of schooling that I talked about. So as schools became more and more focused on drill for tests, and there was less and less creative activity going on in school, and children had less and less time for play, there was a dramatic decline in creativity among school-age children. Now, this wasn't being measured by looking at the brain. We don't know much about I'm sure all kinds of structures in the brain are involved in creative activities. It'd be hard to pinpoint some place to look in the brain to see these changes. But what we do know is that there's a battery of tests called Torrance's tests of creative thinking, which are actually very valid tests of creative thinking. We know that because they've been used now in the United States with normal groups of school children over decades. And those children who score high on this particular battery of tests are far more likely than others to grow up to do something very creative, to become very successful in creative activities, whether it's inventing new products or starting a new company or writing novels or any of those kinds of things that add creatively to the culture. People who scored high on this test as children are far more likely to succeed at than people who scored lower on this test, other things being equal. In fact, it is the best predictor of future creative production. Better than IQ, way better than grades in school, which are really not a predictor at all. Better than teachers or peers' guesses as to who's going to be creative in adulthood. So, so it turns out that as we have added more and more standard schooling to children's lives and taken away the rest of their life, scores on these tests have been continuously going down, such that there was a report a few years ago that showed that the average score at the time of that report, which was about 5 years ago, average score for school-age children in the United States was at what would have been the 15th percentile in 1985, which was a kind of around the year when we started this horrible trajectory of more and more drill and schooling and less creative activity. So the scores had dropped so much that if you were average 5 years ago, you would have only been in the 15th percentile. In other words, 85% of people would have been better than you on that test back in 1985. So that's a huge decline. The tragedy of that is that, we are now in a world where creativity is more important than it ever was before. We've got computers and robots to do all the non-creative work. Increasingly, that's going to be true. That's already to a large extent true. We need people who can think out of the box. We need people who can be creative, which is what computers can't really do. We also need people with social skills, and that can't be taught in school. That's learned in play and self-directed activities. So that's not brain research, but what we know is there's got to be a representation of that in the brain. Anytime there's a change in any kind of way that people are thinking and behaving, that's mediated by the brain. So I'm sure that if one looked hard enough and we had the tools to do so, we would find that those aspects of the brain that are involved in creative activity have been atrophying as a result of too much schooling.
SUSSEN